Every now and then we cover something from the project that this show gets its name from, and this is one of those weeks. So on this episode of This Week in Linux, we'll discuss the release of Linux 5.0. Then we'll cover some other releases from LineageOS, NuTyX, FatDog64, Linux from scratch, and some more core news with releases from the WINE and Vulkan projects. Later in the show, we'll check out some app news from OBS Studio, Headset Music Player, BorgBackup, and a couple desktop weather apps, one with a GUI and the other for the terminal. All that and much more coming up. I'm Michael Tennell with TuxDigital, and this is your weekly source for Linux GNews. This episode of This Week in Linux is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean offers the simplest, most developer-friendly cloud platform. It's optimized to make managing and scaling apps easy with an intuitive API, multiple storage options, integrated firewalls, load balancers, and more. You can get access to this plus access to their world-class customer support for as low as $5 per month. DigitalOcean also offers 2,000 cloud-agnostic tutorials to help you stay up to date with the latest open-source software, languages, and frameworks. You can get started on DigitalOcean for 2 months for free with a $100 credit by going to do.co/tux. That's do.co/tux. And with that $100 credit, you could try out a bunch of their small droplets or even some of their beastly droplets. Like for example, they have a 16 gig RAM, 6 virtual CPU droplet that has 6 terabytes of transfer. You can get started on DigitalOcean with a $100 credit by going to do.co/tux or do.co/tux. And thanks again to DigitalOcean for sponsoring this episode of This Week in Linux. Up first in the show this week is LineageOS 16.0 was released. So up first in the show, before I move on, I actually said that already for the next topic, but because the announcement for this release was done while I was recording this episode, this is basically like a ninja edit, and we're putting this back into the beginning because it should be. So up first in the show is Linux 5.0 has been released. Linus Torvalds has announced today, as of recording, that the Linux 5.0 is now available. However, there's not really anything huge or major advances that are coming out with this change to the 5.0. So they're not naming stuff based on any kind of feature-based milestones or anything. Linus said that he just ran out of fingers and toes to keep track of the naming for the 4.x series. So now it's 5.x series. So there is a lot of cool stuff in it, and this one says Linus said that about 50% of the work is in drivers, 20% is in architectural updates, and 10% is in tooling, and the remaining 20% is all over like documentation, networking, file systems, header file updates, core kernel code, and a bunch of other stuff. He says, no, nothing stands out. He says, I do like seeing how some ancient drivers are getting put out to pasture, like ISDN, which is nice. But anyway, AMD FreeSync support is easily the biggest thing for AMD GPU owners. So AMD FreeSync is going to be supported in the Linux 5.0 kernel, paired with the Mesa 19.0 drivers. So it allows you to get VESA Adaptive Sync and FreeSync working over DisplayPort connections for AMD users, which I am now an AMD user, and I will be streaming some more games with AMD because I can now, which is great. But continuing on this one, so this was one of the few missing things from the open source AMD drivers, so it's awesome to see that in there. But the Team Green or NVIDIA also is getting some new support because the RTX Turing support is going to be in the Nouveau drivers. And there's also some support for Raspberry Pi. We're getting touchscreen support built into the kernel, which is nice, as well as some support for 4K screens, improved support for 4K screens, and a bunch of other things. But for the most part, it's just the same old of every time a new version of the Linux kernel comes out, there's a lot of hardware, peripheral support, and just cleaning up bug fixes and code and just overall polishing. So even though Linus is saying that it's not a huge difference compared to the 4 series, it is still always going to be a good thing for them to be releasing and a good thing for the distros to include because of all the benefits that the hardware gets and etc. So like, for example, if you're a Radeon 7 user, having the Linux 5.0 kernel would be the best option because it has full support for Radeon 7, which just came out recently, which would be great. So hopefully, since this came out basically a month and a half before Ubuntu's next version of 1904, maybe the Linux 5.0 kernel might be included in that. That would be awesome, because if it is, then it might be possible for the hardware enablement stack of 1804 to include Linux 5.0, which means that you might possibly be able to be using brand new hardware of the Radeon 7 inside of an LTS distro, which is crazy and potentially, if it does work, awesome. So that would be cool. But anyway, we don't know about that yet. Hopefully it does happen. But the Linux 5.0 kernel has been released, and if you'd like to learn more, I'll have a link to the announcement from Linus Torvalds in the show notes. LineageOS 16.0 is released. This is the open source alternative to Android. It's based on Android, but they take away all of the about Android, so like the Google apps and the everything like that. You can technically get the Play Store back onto it and use the Google apps if you do want to, but it also removes a lot of other headaches outside of just those things, because there's a lot of stuff that Android does. It's not really good. But anyway, LineageOS is like a compromise of you still using Android as a base, but having more control over the system. And this one, 16.0 is based on Android Pie, which is 9.0. And the LineageOS team says that we feel that the 16.0 branch has reached feature parity with the 15.1 and is ready for initial release. With 16.0 being the most recent and most actively developed branch, on March 1st, 2019, it began receiving nightly builds, and they moved 15.1 to weekly builds. So it's now possible to set automatic update check intervals in the updater, so you can do once a day, once a week, or once a month. So you can do updates for the Lineage in a much more easier method, because in Android even, you still have to go in and check to see if there's something new. And in this case, you can now set it up so that you can do it much more easily. They've also done some new changes to the system, like they've added a new dark mode for the calculator. And now that kind of sounds like not really that important, but the reason why it is because we're using the new Styles API from Android project, which means that it's kind of implying that the dark mode will become like a global thing in Android at some point because of this API change. So it's possible that will happen, and the LineageOS team says that now because of this they have support to use the dark mode in the future. They've also said that they've done a lot of security patches for the past few months or so, and they've upgraded their browser to use Chromium 71, and they are going to discontinue the older version of 14.1 of LineageOS, and that's actually already been discontinued. Sorry, I meant to say in the past they did, but anyway, so one of the cool things is that LineageOS is supported by a lot of devices. They release ROMs for a ton of things, and this particular release they have for Lineage 16.0, they're going to be supporting 31 devices at launch, and will continue to add more devices later on in the future. When they first launch, they have a small subset of a couple dozen, and then they get up to like a couple hundred depending on the particular release. It's really interesting because they have different versions of different devices from a ton of different manufacturers. Like there's probably 15 to 20 manufacturers, and there's probably at least a couple phones, or sometimes even a dozen phones per manufacturer. So it's really impressive the amount of work they do to make sure that if you have an Android phone, you could use LineageOS. So that is very cool. And if you'd like to learn more or try out LineageOS yourself, I have a link to it in the show notes. Oh, by the way, it's not like a simple process of changing, because you're essentially changing out your entire system, like you're replacing the ROM. So while it is something worth looking into, you might want to be careful when you do it, and make sure that you get a ROM that's supported for your phone, and both were supported by the developers, because it could end badly if you don't do it right or don't research it enough. So just to clarify that. But yeah, link in the show notes. Up next in the show is the latest release from WINE. The WINE project had released 4.3, and this has a lot of updates. Mostly it's going to be some changing to some bug fixes and some maintenance updates, but they've also done a lot of cool things as well. So first of all, they've updated the Mono engine to use the latest upstream. They've updated to using more improved handling of kernel objects. And they've also done, what's really I think is interesting is that they've made it possible to support the mixing of DLLs from both 32-bit and 64 bits. So when you can use those in your load path when you activate different applications. So that's pretty interesting. So you now have the ability to do both at the same time. It used to be just one or the other, but now you can do both. Very cool. They've also done an interesting approach by re-implementing the X-Audio 2 library by using F-Audio library. So F-Audio allows the DirectX audio runtime libraries to run on Linux. So they're going to be implementing F-Audio means that they're having WINE work with a much better sound component, so that games will sound better, and various different applications that use sound heavily would be better, higher quality. So very cool to see. And if you'd like to learn more about WINE 4.3, I'll have a link to the WINE HQ website in the show notes. DXVK 1.0 was released this week, and DXVK, if you're not aware, it is a Vulkan-based translation layer for the DXGI, or the Microsoft DirectX graphics infrastructure. So the purpose of it is to make it possible to use DirectX, Direct3D 10, and Direct3D 11 inside of Linux via WINE, or via Proton as well. And DXVK is a really fundamental piece of the Steam Play project in Proton for playing games through Steam that are like not released on Linux natively. So it's a very important piece, and the latest release of 1.0 allows the showing of Direct3D API level via the DXVK HUD. They've added minor improvements to the RADV yielding, RADV yielding better shader code. And also, they've made some improvements for CPU overhead, so it doesn't use as much CPU resources in order to accomplish what it needs to do. And this, they've also made it potentially made it a better frame rate consistency for NVIDIA users with their proprietary drivers in connection with DXVK. So this is pretty cool, and DXVK is a very fundamental piece. So thank you for making this project, and thank you for working with Proton as well, because this is a very important piece to the Linux ecosystem to get more users. And thanks, and congratulations on the milestone of 1.0. So if you're interested checking out the DXVK project and its latest release, I'll have a link in the show notes. Up next in the show is another Vulkan WINE DXVK sort of topic, and this is D9VK. So D9VK is a fork of DXVK code base, but instead of doing the DirectX or Direct3D 10 and 11, this is to do Direct3D 9 support for Vulkan. So there's been work to try to get this into the main DXVK project so that it'll be able to play old games that are no longer being maintained by the developers. So we're like Direct3D 9 has a lot of games for many years ago, and this is an attempt to make those games work on the Linux platform via Proton. So D9VK is a fork of the DXVK project, and we don't really know for sure if it's a temporary fork and that their plan is like ultimately to merge it back into DXVK, or if this is actually like a true fork. So they haven't really said what the case is there yet, but it's really cool to see that they're working on this, because making it possible to have direct support for Direct3D 9, 10, and 11 would cover almost every game that's modern enough to try on your system. So that's fantastic news. And if you'd like to learn more about D9VK, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Up next in the show is a follow-up topic from we talked about OBS Studio a couple episodes ago. Actually, I'm pretty sure it was 55 that we talked about it. And while this is basically just a reiteration of OBS Studio, it also gives me another appreciation for what they're doing with this release, because I recently got a new graphics card. Now, first of all, let's talk about a little bit of what they're coming out in the new version. So they've got new audio filters for different scenes. They've added multi-track audio support through FFmpeg. They've added the ability to change the base output resolution to the size of the source to make it really quickly to do so. They've also made it possible to connect your Twitch account with OBS so that you can essentially log in to your Twitch account and have the Twitch chat built into your scene with OBS, and it's an interesting approach. Unfortunately, that's not available through Linux yet because they have to fix the plugin or the source that's not available on Linux from the OBS browser system. They are working on to making that browser work properly on Linux, so that will be coming in the future. However, what is important is that they actually released this new encoder for Linux built in by default on OBS for VA API, which is the API for hardware acceleration and hardware encoding for AMD graphics cards, which means that now you can easily use OBS to run a game on your graphics card and OBS on the same graphics card, provided that you have a powerful enough card to do so. I previously did not. I actually had a card that could stream perfectly fine or play games perfectly fine, but not do both at the same time, which is good that they released this feature in this version, because just a couple days ago, I got a new graphics card that's an AMD card, and it's great, but without this support, it wouldn't be as efficient, and it would still have a problem with the bottleneck of the CPU and etc. However, the VA API worked fantastic because I streamed yesterday some Rocket League gaming, and also I plan on streaming some more games in the future, as well as doing some community games for a variety of different games such as Ballistic Overkill, Xonotic, or Super Tux Kart, and all kinds of stuff. So people can, if you want to, feel free to join the Discord server, which is tuxdigital.com/discord, or the Telegram group, which is tuxdigital.com/telegram, to have a join in when I go start these games. I'll announce it in those groups. So if you would like to know, actually also Twitter, so you can follow on Twitter too. Anyway, if you'd like to participate in those things, you're more than welcome to do so. Just join those, and I'll have links to those in the show notes below as well. But yes, OBS Studio is great. It's really a fundamental piece to this show. So, anytime I get the chance to talk about it, I'm happy to do so. And thanks to OBS for making it support for that encoder, which makes gaming on Linux and streaming games on Linux much easier and much more fluid. So thanks again for that. And if you'd like to learn more about OBS Studio, I have a link to it in the show notes. Up next in the show is Headset. Headset 2.1.2 was released, and Headset is a desktop music player application built to use YouTube and Reddit. So it starts out with a home screen dashboard structure that shows a popularity of genres and eras of music, and then it also allows you to do YouTube searches. But what really makes it a interesting and powerful app is the Reddit integration. So you can use Reddit subreddits of different music genres as a sort of radio via Reddit. So it's an interesting app, and it has a lot of benefits, and also it has a little bit of a quirk that some people might not like. It's based on Electron, so for those people who have a problem with Electron, there you go. But it does have a lot of interesting features as well. So it has the ability to share, not share, but has an ability to have music from over 80 subreddits. It also categorizes the music and plays them automatically in like a radio style similar to Spotify. So you could say it's kind of like an open source Spotify that uses YouTube and Reddit to accomplish the function. It's a pretty interesting application, and they also do have a pro premium version that's like $3 a month or something. It was less than that, but I don't remember exactly what it is, but something less than, it's like $2 something. It's interesting that it is open source, so you can use it, but they have extra, like a premium version that has extra bonus features. However, it's not required to use the premium version in order to use the application. It's just an extra stuff that you could do. But anyway, it's a pretty cool idea. So if you are interested in checking it out, I have a link to Headset in the show notes. So up next in the app news section, we have two weather apps. But first, we're going to talk about Meteo. I think it's how you say it, Meteo. And it is a GTK-based weather app that is using the Open Weather Map API. And it gives you access to current weather, information about temperature, pressure, wind speed, direction, sunrise and sunset, like all the basics that you would expect a weather app to have. It also gives you forecast information like the next 18 hours or the next 5 days. And it also gives you the option to choose the units that you use for like the temperature and wind speed and etc. So it gives you three options. One is metric, the other is imperial, and the other one is British, which until this live stream, I had no idea what that meant. Thankfully, someone on the live stream clued me in that British means you have the Celsius temperature, but you use wind speed in the imperial structure, so miles per hour. So that's interesting. Didn't know that. Also, it allows you to choose your city in a kind of an easier way than you would normally expect, because it, like with Open Weather Map, that you have to know the city identifying number, or in this case, they give it a map that you can just choose the area that you want the weather information for. So that is very cool. They also have a lot of other weather info on these maps, so you can see like the temperature and like different ranges of the areas, as well as a system tray indicator that you could use. So overall, this is a pretty cool application for its purpose. You know, a lot of people don't like, care that much about weather. They just go up on search it on a search engine or something like that, or they have like a panel applet for their desktop environment. But this gives you a lot more information, and the map stuff is pretty cool too. So if you are looking for if you're looking for a weather app, then Meteo might be worth checking out. It's actually interesting because this is kind of similar to GNOME Weather, but GNOME Weather has not had an update in a while. However, I did find out recently that a new developer is taking over GNOME Weather, so they might be adding some more features in the future. But in the meantime, Meteo is a good option for people who are GNOME users. And from that application, I'd like to show you a console-based or command line interface-based weather app called, I don't know how you're supposed to say this, but I assume weather.in. And this is an interesting approach because you don't really have to install anything. You just run a git, or basically a curl or a wget command in your console, and it will give you the information through your terminal. So if you do curl wttr.in or weather.in, it will output the weather info based on your IP address. So it tries to geolocate based on your IP. And I've tested it a few times with some VPNs and everything, and it does pretty well to what it's supposed to be. So it's interesting. You can also choose to get the data from a specific city rather than based on an API. I'll have a link to the GitHub page for wttr.in's GitHub project, because they have instructions for how to find the right city and what the URL syntax should be in order to do that. So once you get your city, you can just copy and paste it or save it somewhere and make it a script or whatever you want, and that way you can anytime you want check out the weather based on in your terminal. So that's very cool. If you do want to check out weather and you want a terminal approach, wttr.in is a really good option. And it worked quite well, super fast, and I was impressed by it. So if you do want that is an option for you. And I'll have a link to both Meteo and weather.in in the show notes. This episode is also brought to you by Linux is Everywhere, the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt to be specific. It's a shirt I made to celebrate the proliferation of Linux. The concept of the design has Tux blended into the background to convey the message, even if you aren't aware that Linux is there. It probably is. The shirt is available for shipping inside of North America and Europe. You can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxEverywhere, or if you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxEverywhereEU for shipping inside of Europe. Up next in the show is the latest release of 8.4 from Linux from Scratch. So if you've not heard of it, Linux from Scratch is not necessarily a distro, actually. It is a book that teaches you how to build Linux distribution or a Linux system from scratch. And it makes sense, that's the name of it. The latest release has updates to a lot of different things. such they got a new version of Bash, binutils, glibc, and many more. A total of 33 packages were updated for this latest release, and there's been a lot of changes to the text in the book. They've also updated the kernel to 4.20.12, and they've also updated the other version of Linux from scratch, because there's Linux from scratch, then there's Beyond Linux from Scratch, or BLFS. And this gives you like a lot more features and extras on top of the Linux from scratch, as well as some binaries and stuff. So they have multiple versions of Linux from scratch book. You have the systemd version or the non-systemd version. They also have a systemd and non-systemd version of BLFS. So it's a really good way to learn the intricacies of Linux. So if you were ever curious about how to build a system from scratch, this is the best way to do so, because it's a nice guide that shows you how to do it. Now, you could do trial and error and it would take forever, but this is a great way to get like at the lowest possible level, but still have a guide to show you how to do it all. So it's a very cool book. It is pretty complicated, to be fair. So if you are interested, just so you know, it will take a while to do it, quite a while to do it, many days. So, because you have to compile everything, and you have to set up all the flags and everything, how it compiles before you get to the compilation part. So, it's a lot to do, but it is pretty cool. So, if you do want to try it, you could also take the other route of starting with, learning how to build Arch, and Arch would be a way to learn in a more gradual approach. So you learn an easier, more streamlined way to how to set up a system, and then you could transition to Gentoo or Slackware that you learn even more, but still have a little bit of an umbrella or parachute to learn from, and then go to Linux from scratch, because it is a massive jump if you've never done that before. Anyway, so if you are interested in checking out, I'll have a link to Linux from scratch in the book in the show notes below. So for the next two more topics, we're going to stay on the Linux from scratch side of things. But these two distributions that we're going to talk about are actually based on Linux from scratch. So they might be a good introduction, or at least somewhat to try out Linux from scratch if you want to see how it's like before you go through the whole process. But NuTyX 10.6 was released this week, and NuTyX, I think that's how you say it, I don't really know, but that's what I assume, is a distribution based on Linux from scratch, and they have their own custom package manager that they built. So it's cool because this has a lot of flexibility because it's based on Linux from scratch, so they have a lot of interesting approaches that they did. This latest release updates their kernel, and they have two different kernel options. You can use the 4.14 or 4.19 kernel. They also have a interesting approach to 32-bit and 64-bit versions. They have ISOs for 64-bit and 32-bit, but they don't have multi-lib. So if you were to use a 64-bit version of their system, you won't be able to install 32-bit packages as well, because that would be a lot more work than they were willing to do. So if you have 32-bit and you want to use 32-bit, feel free, but you won't be able to use 64-bit packages, well, at all anyway. But you won't be able to do the reverse either. This release also made it possible for Card's package manager to now track orphan packages and remove them automatically. If you go to their website, they give you these 10 benefits of NuTyX and then why you should use it. So I'm not going to cover all 10 of them because there's quite a few. Oh, well, there's 10 actually, but I have time for all 10, so I'll just cover a few of them that might be worth checking out. So first of all, you can install NuTyX from almost any other distribution. So you don't actually have to replace it. You just download the bash script named install NuTyX or install-NuTyX, and you can try it out from wherever you want. It also has a ports collection system that is like super flexible with managing software. So you can have applications that are individual applications and also collections of applications, so it makes it easier to install applications through these collections. You can do binary install of NuTyX or a source-based install of NuTyX, so you can do compilation if you want. Now, this uses their recipes port system that allows you to install from the source. It's interesting because it's very simple scripts or recipes to make these scripts. So it's only like 10 lines long or so. So it's interesting that they can do this through their cards system. Like overall, it's an interesting distribution. Let's move on to the next topic, which is also based on Linux from scratch. Is FatDog64 has released their version 800, and FatDog64, you might have heard it before if you are a fan of Puppy Linux or have known about Puppy Linux. It originally was created as a fatter or more has more built-in applications version of Puppy Linux. So, but FatDog has grown to become an independent distribution. So they say that it's a matured 64-bit Linux distribution, but it still keeps true to the spirit of Puppy Linux: small, fast, and efficient. So FatDog is versatile. They have a lot of interesting approaches because of how it is still a very lightweight distribution. So it can be put on CDs or any live CD or live USB or whatever. And what's really cool is that it doesn't require any repartitioning of your system. You can just install it and it stores the settings on your existing partition. So regardless of whether you're using a FAT partition or extended 4 or NTFS even, it has support for a bunch of other ones. Like it's a pretty cool approach to the system because like it just recently switched from Puppy to Linux from scratch. So I'm actually interested in checking it out because I haven't used it since it was Puppy based, but that's also many years ago. But I'm curious about how they're doing their system because, well, 1, it's a fun name, and 2, it's Linux from scratch, and 3, it's meant to be a super fast, lightweight system. So all those combinations, pretty interested. So I'm gonna check that out. So they actually updated this version to the latest Linux kernel of 4.19, or the latest LTS Linux kernel. They've also added Redshift, and they've made it easier to set the location for Redshift to be accurate to like automating the activation of Redshift. So it has some nice user benefits as well as being a very lean but robust system. So if you're interested in checking out FatDog64, their version 800, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Up next, Mozilla has released their Common Voices dataset. Common Voices is a project that Mozilla started, and the goal is to release voice-enabled products themselves, but also providing a project for researchers and other people to create their own products based on this data. So this is a multi-language data set that has 18 languages represented, including English, French, German, Mandarin Chinese, and also many, many more, including Welsh, and one I'm going to butcher because I have never heard of this before, Kabyle, I don't know. That's wrong. Whatever it was, it's probably wrong. Altogether, the new dataset includes approximately 1,400 hours, close to that. Actually, at the time of this recording, it's 1,361 hours from clips, but from more than 42,000 people. The dataset is publicly available, so you can get it for startups, researchers, and anyone interested in just voice-enabled technologies. So you can go and try and get the dataset if you wanted to kind of incorporate it into your own product if you wanted. Like, for example, Mycroft has chosen to include it in their open source voice-based assistant. The same thing with Leon, which is an open source personal assistant, and they're going to be using the Common Voice stuff for them as well. There's also another thing that Mozilla is doing, which is Project Deep Speech, and it's a open source speech to text or text to speech engine and training models for machine learning groups. So this Common Voice is deeply connected to the Deep Speech. I didn't mean to do that pun, but it's connected to Deep Speech, and it's an interesting approach because it allows you to create an open source ecosystem for a competitor to Amazon Echo, for example, or the Google Home, and etc. So that's pretty cool. And if you'd like to learn more about this, I'll have a link in the show notes to the Mozilla's Common Voice dataset. Up next in the show is BorgBackup and Vorta. Vorta is a GUI for BorgBackup. We'll get to that in a second. But first, BorgBackup is a deduplicating command line backup program. The main goal of Borg is to provide an efficient and secure way to backup data. It uses a data deduplication technique that makes it possible for using transactional backups rather than having a bunch of giant backups every time you make a backup and have a ton of different data that's duplicated. So it allows you to do transactional to make it where it's only saving what is changed. They also have an interesting encryption technique, which makes it suitable to, well, they say it makes it suitable to use these backups in not trusted targets. So for example, if you were putting it on Dropbox, they say that it's, you could be comfortable because the compression and the encryption would make it pretty much not likely for Dropbox to be able to crack into it. If you're wondering why I'm saying Dropbox specifically, it's because they have a master key that essentially allows them to get access to any of the stuff on their servers. They claim that there's encryption from using Dropbox, but if you have a key, that's not really encryption. But they use the LZ4 compression algorithm, and they use 256-bit AES encryption for their backups. Also, I talked about Borg before on the show on episode 9, way back in episode 9, and well, I'll just save it as a treat if you decide to go and check out that episode. It's definitely interesting in comparison, anyway. So yeah. Now let's talk about Vorta. So Vorta is a fairly new GUI for BorgBackup. Borg is a command line backup tool, but it has a barrier to entry, obviously, because it's a command line tool. So some people who would like a GUI version, Vorta provides that with a Python approach, and it actually makes it a lot easier. It has a system trace that's built in to detect your system theme, and it also allows you to do auto starting for the application, so you can automatically have the backups running just when you start up the system. That also allows you to have control over choosing which kind of compression you would like to use, like zlib or zstd and some others. So it's a pretty interesting thing. It's available right now in a variety of different repositories, so you can try to install. You can install pretty much both of these, whatever you want, whatever distro, because it's in a lot. So most of the major distros. But anyway, if you'd like to check it out, BorgBackup is the tool for the command line, if you'd like to use that. And if you'd like to use a GUI, Vorta is the option for that. I have a link to both of those in the show notes. Up next in the show, OnlyOffice announced that they have a new blockchain-based end-to-end encrypted document encryption for their Office suite. So it makes sharing of documents more secure across multiple platforms. That's how they describe it. So but the blockchain is used in the way of sharing the passwords and the information. So it's interesting. So the OnlyOffice uses AES 256 encryption to encrypt the files, and then uses data transfer with also support for collaboration and a private blockchain network to store and transfer passwords privately. So the documents can be encrypted with a new end-to-end encryption. And this also supports a variety of different formats. And the format, so for example, it supports LibreOffice ODT, which is the open document text document, or text, and also they have the Microsoft Office DocX, XLSX, PPTX for Excel and for PowerPoint, Oracle's ODS with the open document spreadsheet, as well as the ODX business process orchestration diagram file format used by Microsoft's BizTalk server. That was a lot. Users will also be able to securely share encrypted documents for real-time collaboration. Now, this is the interesting piece. So it's not only is it end-to-end encrypted and it's using blockchain, it also supports collaboration. So they say that all documents and user inputs are encrypted on the client side. Therefore, the data is transferred to the server in the encrypted form and is decrypted in real time on the receiving end if the user has the appropriate access rights to the document. So everybody's connected to the server and everything is being decrypted on the server side, so it's being back and forth fairly quickly, so it allows them to have a secure document approach while also having a collaboration approach. So I'm not sure how, they say it's real time, but I didn't see a demo of it, so I don't know how real time it is. But even if it's slightly laggy, it's interesting that it's even possible because it doesn't sound like it would be using the blockchain technology. So that's very cool and very interesting. If you'd like to check it out, I'll have a link to their blog post in the show notes below. Purism has announced PureBoot. Purism is the company behind the much anticipated Librem 5 phone and also the Librem laptops. They've actually announced this new PureBoot system, which takes privacy and security to the next level by replacing the system BIOS. So they state that the boot process in computer hardware forms the foundation of security for the rest of the system, which is fairly true, but there's some issues involved in that, but not exactly. But anyway, they say that they're going to replace the system BIOS by doing these things. First, disabling the Intel management engine permanently, using CoreBoot free software BIOS replacement, a trusted TPM chip for hardware key storage and decryption, using Heads, a tamper-evident boot software that is loaded from CoreBoot, using multi-factor authentication that unlocks the disk encryption using the Librem key, and the Librem 5 USB security token. So all of these different methods make it possible to replace the system BIOS and making a much more secure booting process. So these processes combined help you in a case like theft with heavy encryption. It protects against BIOS malware, kernel rootkits. For example, the Librem key also detects BIOS tampers. So if someone tries to mess with your system, you just have the Librem key into your laptop, and it will tell you whether or not the BIOS has been affected. And also, they use free software all of this is free software, so you can audit the BIOS and for security bugs or backdoors or anything like that. So now this is specifically for their hardware because of all these different pieces of things that they can only do for their hardware. So their next laptops will have this approach. In some theories that it might be possible because the code is open source that another company might want to implement these things, but for now, Librem is the only hardware that's going to have this. So they'll be shipping PureBoot in their new hardware and provide an upgrade process for existing customers. All of this is expected to take place in the next quarter of this year. So it's very interesting that they're doing all of this work on top of also doing the Librem 5, because the Librem 5 itself sounds like it's a lot of work to do just that alone. So having something like this also in their, on their plate is interesting and impressive. So hope this works out well, and I hope the Librem 5 does come to fruition, because they did get a delay we talked about recently, but their delay was reasonable because of some hardware problems. But overall, I do hope this works out well, and I do hope the Librem 5 comes out soon, because I can't wait to play with that. And it would be interesting to try out these to see how much they've done as far as the security and the system BIOS stuff. So anyway, if you'd like to learn more about PureBoot from Purism, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on the show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the TuxDigital channel, we have multiple ways you can contribute via PayPal, Patreon, and many others. You can learn more by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. Or you can order the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt by going to tuxdigital.com/LinuxIsEverywhere. If you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxEverywhereEU for shipping inside of Europe. We also have ways to contribute without any cost to you by using our affiliate links. You can find links for places like Amazon, private internet access, and many more by going to tuxdigital.com/affiliates. If you'd like to submit some good news to the show, then visit the subreddit by going to thisweekinlinux.reddit.com. If you'd like some more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episode of Destination Linux, as I'm a co-host of that show. And just a reminder, this show is live every Saturday, well, usually every Saturday, so join us in the live chat room to discuss all the latest Linux news each week. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell with Tux Digital, and as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying Linux.